Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining me in 2024. It's hard to believe that we have this new year and this new opportunity to look at things and explore things and I have a whole new lineup in Friday Forum. I have new guests that you're going to be introduced to and some popular returning guests. My name, as I mentioned, is Cyndy McDonald. I'm an instructor for the UCLA College Counseling Certificate Program. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm an educator, and I'm also a business coach. And I'm so honored to be able to bring to you these Friday forums on a regular basis to talk about important subjects to us with people who are experts in these areas. And I'm so honored today to have as my guest Robert Schaeffer, more commonly known as Bob. And Bob is with Fair Test, and he and I have been colleagues for a number of years. And I wanted to talk with him. We're going to talk about the digital SAT and standardized testing. So as you're logging in, go ahead and let Bob know where you're from. So put your name and your location, and it gives us an opportunity for you to say hello to each other. So welcome, Bob. I'm glad to have you here today. We're going to have a great conversation about things that are important to our students and our families in our schools on standardized tests. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Cyndy, and Happy New Year to everybody who's joined us.
It is nice to have this as a new year, isn't it? I want to let people know a little bit about your background. Bob Schaeffer is currently the Public Education Director of Fair Test, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, where he coordinated the organization's university admissions reform program over several decades. And we've been watching that. We've been watching that test optional list and all those things grow and expand. He's also coordinated the organization's university, he has also served as the organization's executive director or co-executive director for 5 years. Currently, Mr. Schaeffer is the research director of the Massachusetts Legislators Joint Committee on Human Services. That's a mouthful. Sounds very engaging and interesting. Editorial writer at the NBC TV affiliate in Boston and talk show host at the regional NPR affiliate. He also worked at the Education Research Center of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whom we all lovingly call MIT, right? Where he was both an undergraduate and a graduate student. Bob is frequently quoted by major media outlets, and then if you've heard him, you understand why. He's very articulate and very passionate about this topic. He's been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, NPR, CNN, Associated Press, and in many trade publications. He's also presented at national conferences and done a lot of presenting and advocating in many different areas. So Bob, thank you for all of that and for being on that forefront for so many years. I think it shows to us how important these being advocates is, and yet how long it takes. But look at all the changes that you've seen over the years, right?
Well, there certainly have been major changes. One of the first projects Fair Test did after it was launched by leaders of civil rights, education reform, and women's and students groups in the mid-1980s was to take a look at schools that didn't use standardized tests for admission. And it led to a report called Beyond Standardized Tests, Admissions Alternatives at Work. And we were able to list about 24 schools across the nation that either for undergraduate admissions or graduate school did not rely on the ACT, SAT, GRE, GMAT, MCAT. And now there are on fairtest.org on our website, the list of test optional and test blind schools that do not require ACT or SAT scores to be submitted before admissions decisions are made is now over 2,050 four-year colleges and universities. That's out of a universe of about 2,267, the federal government says, schools that admit first-year students for bachelor's degrees. So now more than 90% of all four-year schools in the US do not require all or many applicants to submit test scores before admissions decisions are made. And at the graduate school level, there's a rapidly growing movement. We was coined the Grexit, GRE exit movement, to eliminate the GRE and other tests like the GMAT, LSAT, MCAT as well.
And those are definitely, we see that movement at both ends, right? And we're talking about the K-12 and that aspect, and then also, as you mentioned, the graduate. Let's take a step back a little bit and tell us a little bit more about fairtest.org itself. What is its mission and when was it founded?
Fairtest was founded in 1985 after a conference that was convened up the Hudson River from New York City that had leaders of civil rights litigating groups, women's organizations, some student groups like the PIRGs, and a number of academics who concluded that there needed to be an organization in the US devoted to exposing the flaws and misuses of standardized tests while simultaneously advocating for better forms of assessment. And that led to the founding of the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, its full legal name, in Cambridge, Massachusetts at that time, to be the nation's testing watchdog. And over the years, we've developed there's always more fires to fight than we have resources to deal with them, but we have active programs dealing with everything from sort of kindergarten entry tests right up through occupational licensing tests for everything from lawyers to nuclear power plant operators.
Wow.
But we've always had major programming in university admissions and have had tremendous success in that area.
Well, and I don't think we don't think of testing oftentimes from that equity access perspective or even as a civil rights issue. And yet it is. I know in my work and through Avid, we were constantly battling that as well, and from an equity perspective. So that does so nice to have a watchdog. And
I mean, and Fairtest has one foot anchored in the equity civil rights world and the other foot in the education reform, better assessment world. And we try and blend the two to argue that, as we said, our goal is to make assessment fair, open, and educationally sound.
And that's educationally sound is kind of the key issue right now with the SAT, the digital SAT. So let's talk about that. How does the digital one differ from the traditional one?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize, and many longstanding counselors know this, this is the fifth comprehensive overhaul of the SAT and Fairtest experience, the third this century. And about every 7 or 8 years, they come out like it's auto manufacturers with, the new Cadillac with or without tail fins, or maybe it's the new Coke. This time around, the changes are a bit more fundamental. Often it's the equivalent of painting lipstick on the pigs, and the test goes from 1,600 to 2,400, and there is an essay, there isn't an essay. This time, the fundamental delivery mechanism of the exam has changed to keep up with technology, moving from a 3+ hour pencil and paper, multiple choice, largely multiple choice exam to one that is administered on laptops or tablets, on computers, and one that is computer adaptive, meaning that two people sitting next to each other in a testing center will not get the same questions. They will get questions that are in theory, and one of the problems with the new SAT is that the algorithm for determining which questions you get is a black box. Nobody knows except for the test makers what the formula is for deciding whether you get a tougher or an easier question next after your answer. But it is much more customized. And a result of that is that the test is significantly shorter. It'll be barely 2 hours in administration. It'll be solely on laptops. Many of the questions are going to be shorter than what people remember on the old pencil and paper SAT. The reading comprehension passages are typically 150 words or less. There are no long, boring essays. There may be short, boring essays, and a series of questions, one question after each one. So it's a different experience, and one that raises equity concerns for kids who are not comfortable with computers. But overall, it appears to be a more consumer-friendly product, not a better product in terms of the goals of the test. The problems with the test, and we do focus on that, is that in the thousands of words the College Board has published about the exam, nowhere do they say it will be a better predictor of undergraduate success, and nowhere will it say it will be a fairer measure of a diverse population's readiness for college. Now, as I recall, since we've been doing it, those are the two primary criticisms of the SAT. It's unfair and it's not an accurate predictor. So this changes the format, doesn't change the core fundamentals. It'll still be a highly coachable, often inaccurate, sometimes biased exam that measures only a small fraction of what it takes to succeed as an undergraduate.
Right. And yeah, and if the fundamental purpose or premise of it is not changed, whether it's electronic or large or on whatever system, that's not going to change.
And particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, the vast majority of colleges in the United States have concluded that they can do fair, accurate admissions just as well without the testing requirement as with it. Pre-COVID, about 45% of the colleges in the country were test optional, including a number of super selective ones like the University of Chicago. But with the pandemic, everybody went test optional. In the first year, nearly all schools have maintained the testing waiver, some for multiple years, and many permanently. In California, a number of the public universities, the University of California and California State System have gone test blind, which means they won't even look at test scores or consider them if submitted. And I've been on panels with a number of admissions staff from the UC system. They're able to run admissions. You don't need test scores. So from our perspective, the primary purpose of this revision of the SAT was to try and reposition that test in a shrinking marketplace. The College Board and its competitor at ACT suffered significant revenue losses over the last several years. They've laid off staff. About 15% of staff at both companies have been laid off because of declines in testing volume. And it was necessary to refresh the product in order to try and boost revenue.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. We used to have, as you said, the essay, and that's no longer there. We used to have the SAT subjects, and then they went to SAT2, and then they went back to the SAT subjects, and those no longer exist either. So then that puts the emphasis back on AP, right?
And at selective schools, in terms of testing data, AP probably plays a more significant role. I've done panels with a number of admissions directors who claim that it does not have a significant role as many people fear. Because at sophisticated admissions offices, they recognize the huge differences across the country and the opportunities to take AP courses and tests from under-resourced schools to wealthy ones.
Yeah. And that is very true. So when the electronic SAT was released, it was released internationally first. So how did that rollout go? You know, we're looking at the first electronic version coming out in the US in March, but what was the experience internationally?
Well, the test was rolled out outside the US last March, 9 months ago. And the reason they did it overseas is because they had a tremendous security problem with administering tests, pencil and paper tests overseas. Every round of the SAT outside the US in the last several years had been compromised because people got their hands on the test in advance and were able to circulate some or all questions, and so that a number of kids had a grossly unfair advantage. The rollout of the digital SAT globally appeared not to have any significant problems. They worked very hard to make sure that the technology worked internationally. And that was a good sign that for the upcoming rollout in the US. A bad sign is that in October of 2023, the College Board rolled out the digital PSAT and it collapsed in many places in the first few minutes of administration. Servers couldn't handle the demand, capacity wasn't there, customer service was non-existent, schools were left hanging, and counselors are always left in the middle suffering. And I really appreciate the crucial role you play in how you're put in the middle on this. But many schools had to reschedule and try it again, which was very disruptive and not a good sign for the upcoming March rollout of the digital SAT in the US.
And that was one of my questions as well. You know, what does it look like? I know in past rollouts, like we remember years ago when the Common App debuted a new version, it came out, it was a disaster.
Right.
And so has College Board done anything to prepare to boost things up, because they're going to
Well,
be
the college, Fairtest often wins points with the news media by urging reporters to call the College Board because they get the same non-answers, obfuscation, and finger pointing that counselors often get from them. The College Board says that they have solved the problems and that the digital SAT will work on March 9th as when it's rolled out. They also had tremendous problems the first time they rolled out the digital AP exams in the pandemic. And there was, we were involved in a $500 million lawsuit against the College Board because many kids had got black screens of death after completing the test, or finished the test and never got scores, or got scores which were totally ludicrous. So, we're hopeful, but those who want to trust the College Board can, but we're in the verify category. So we'll see what they do.
Trust but verify, right?
Yes.
Well, so we did have a conversation last night. I was mentioning, as I posted this on social media, one of our counselors in Japan said that, his students in Japan had a much better experience taking the digital one, and he found it much easier to administer. So how does that look from an administrative, my role as a counselor in a school? How does that make it easier for me?
In a well-resourced institution with student and staff who are, computer literate and regularly use laptops and tablets in their work, and that has sufficient bandwidth, yes, it should be ultimately a smoother experience. Makes it easier to deliver the test during school days rather than on weekends, and the test is more of a self-contained vehicle. It administers itself. At the proctors and test site supervisors, in theory, have to do less running around and craziness in order to keep and timekeeping in order to make the test work. Whether that plays out in less resourced environments where kids have had fewer experiences with computers and testing remains to be seen.
Mhm.
The concern is that, like so many other technological changes, it further advantages those who already have the most advantages.
Yeah, who have the resources and things.
But they've clearly, the PSAT experience notwithstanding, they've clearly spent a lot of time and resources beta testing this system, and it looks on past draws, and the same thing happened when the new GRE back 20 years ago that went to computer, huge crashes. I mean, the people rushed products to market before they were ready for prime time.
Mhm.
It happens with K-12 computerized testing still. And one hopes that the years of a development, there was a year delay in the rollout of the computerized SAT in the US and the experience with overseas administrations made it more likely that it'll be a satisfactory administration for kids. But we'll be watching very carefully to see whether that materializes.
Yeah, yeah.
But the bigger question remains, if taking a poor assessment that was on pencil and paper and transforming it onto a computer doesn't make it a better assessment, makes it a different assessment. But if it's going to be coachable in different ways, maybe in ways that further advantage kids who have access to coaching because of the sophistication involved in understanding the algorithm for delivering the computer adaptive subsections of the test. There's a lot of as yet unknowns, and still the fundamental question: will it be a better tool in the admissions process? Will it be a fairer tool? No evidence of yes to those questions.
Yeah. So it goes back to the fundamental purpose and reason for its existence.
And quite frankly, who needs it? I mean, if
we don't need it for UCLA or UC Berkeley.
If Stanford and Caltech and UC Berkeley don't need tests, and Harvard and Yale and Princeton don't need them, and most flagship publics and regional publics and small liberal arts colleges are functioning quite happily without standardized tests. Some of them for as long as 50 years have been test optional. It works. You don't need the exam.
So I want to go back to the prep for students for a minute. Have there been ways identified that is going to be able to coach students on the SAT? I know I have people in my audience who do test prep. So what are they finding from that perspective?
Well, talking to people in the test prep coaching industry, there have been two trends from the introduction of the computerized SAT. One is a surge of people into SAT coaching, just because it's new and different, and that every time the SAT has changed, there's fear, and you go to the experts. The major companies, be they Princeton Review or Compass or Method or Kaplan, Fairtest has no business relationships with any of them, and view them as kind of a necessary evil that exists because of the test. And that they have all produced pretty sophisticated test coaching programs. Many of them have modeled the Blue Book system that the College Board is using for the digital SAT. The other trend is that many more kids are expected to take the ACT because it's tried and true. You knew that the test prep book from 5 years ago that your older sibling used is still appropriate. And you'll stick with the what you're accustomed to until the digital SAT proves itself.
Yeah.
So we expect to see, lower volume digital SAT, more volume ACT, more coaching in the short run. And but all in an environment in which there's much less pressure to take tests because of, particularly on the West Coast, where essentially every university on the West Coast, not just California, but Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, don't require tests. Why take them?
Right. right, exactly. That's what my students, and since I'm in California, that's exactly what they say is, why take the test? Like, it's not going to help me get into the UCs or CSUs. They'll use it maybe for some private schools, but I do see a lot of students from a counselor perspective, for all those reasons you cited, like, I'm just going to go with the ACT. It'll be accepted. I know how to prep for it. Parents are comfortable, parents too. When something's new and different, it makes them very uneasy, and they don't like working with unknowns. So I do expect to see the ACT. The only challenge I see is if there are going to be enough administration, is the ACT bump it up expecting this, because I know in my area, my students have to travel quite a distance to take the ACT because the SAT is more common and more available. So
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a cycle in which, less kids take the SAT, so there are fewer administrations, and so it's harder to take the test, so less kids take the SAT. It's not necessarily a bad cycle from our perspective.
True. So what is the difference? That was one of my questions too. What's the difference between the ACT and SAT?
Much less, well, one huge difference is delivery format in the US starting in March, the next SAT. In terms of content, not all that much. There are slight differences in content coverage. The new digital SAT has less geometry than it appears that the ACT does. But both test a set of verbal and written and quantitative skills that one believes are helpful for college success. Not the most important things for undergraduate success. No test can measure your ability to deliver on deadline, to self-discipline, to work with others, et cetera. And that's why tests are such a weak predictor, even the best tests.
Right. And it goes back to the whole fundamental. It's a test, it's a standardized test, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but now we've been talking about the large number of schools that are test optional, and you've mentioned another term, test blind. What's the difference?
Well, test blind means that test scores will not be considered at any stage of the admissions process in any way. Test optional means that if they are submitted, the school will give some consideration to them in the admissions process. Test blind, there are about 88 test blind institutions of 2,200 four-year schools, the vast majority of which are in California. The California, both public systems, the University of California system and the California state system are both test optional. And then there are a number of smaller liberal arts schools across the country which will not consider test scores.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's confusing to parents and students. And then it's also can be not necessarily confusing, but complicated.
Well, and then there's another term that gets batted around, which is test flexible. And there used to be 5-6 years ago, a number of colleges that say, well, you don't have to submit ACT or SAT if you submit AP, IB, Cambridge, or some other form of or SAT subject tests back in those days. There are no schools in that category anymore. And then we've noticed an increase in number of schools saying, well, test preferred. You don't have to, but we'd like it if you do. And nuanced language like that. But for the vast majority of schools, test optional is the real policy. They have set up systems so that if you don't submit test scores, you're neither advantaged nor disadvantaged in the admissions process. And I saw a comment in the chat. Yes, some schools do use test scores for so-called merit aid, and that's important. There are more than enough seats at colleges for every kid who wants to go to college. But if they don't have money, that's a totally meaningless opportunity. In fact, the number of merit scholarships tied to test scores has declined quite rapidly over the last 5 or 6 years, so that only about a quarter of so-called merit programs are attached to test scores. And we did a recent report. My colleague Akil Bello at Fairtest did a report on this 6 months ago, and it's linked on our homepage at fairtest.org. And you can see how relatively small the number of test score-based merit scholarships is right now.
And that's one of the advocacy things you're working on is decoupling testing with those merit scholarships, especially places like Florida. What other states still have those merits?
Florida has the Bright Future scholarships. Louisiana has LEAP. South Carolina has Palmetto. Georgia has 2 scholarship programs, one of which doesn't require test scores, HOPE, and one of which, Zell Miller, does require test scores. And that's, in terms of the biggies, that's about it. And of course, the National Merit Scholarship Program, which Fairtest has always said should be called the National Test Taking Scholarship Program.
I love that. Well, we have quite a few comments here in the chat, so let's go through some of this. So Leah says, I'm curious how the College Board is validating scores to be the same on the old and the new SAT when it's changed so much. How do they ensure a 1400 on the old is 1400 on the new?
Call me curious too. In fact, when you're dealing with the testing industry, there is no outside governmental oversight body. There is less control over what goes into tests than over the food we feed our pets. How do they validate the test and its scores? They say so. Now they do claim to have studies, but they do the studies themselves. There's no independent body. There's no Consumer Report or Underwriters Lab or Food and Drug Administration that verifies the claim of testing companies. And that's one of the major problems. And there have been companies, and wouldn't necessarily say the ACT or the College Board, which has been found in court for kind of making up validation when necessary to sell product. I mean, these are businesses. The College Board and ACT and Educational Testing Services are all nonprofits, but they make huge amounts of money. They pay their executives millions of dollars a year. They own their own. The Educational Testing Service owns its own, kind of estate outside of Princeton, New Jersey, with goose ponds and horse trails and equestrian trails and things like that. These are very good ways to make money. And like everybody else with self-interest, you don't necessarily trust what they say without independent evidence. And there is no independent evidence of that claim yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Should students download the Blue Book ahead of time? I'm not sure what the Blue Book is.
The Blue Book is the tool that the College Board has developed to deliver the test. Absolutely, yes. You want to, just like we would tell people when the SAT was delivered pencil and paper, fine if you want to prep on computer, take practice test, pencil and paper. Take a practice test on the Blue Book or something similar, or one of the facsimiles of it that the test prep companies have made. It's a different experience doing a test online rather than in pencil and paper. You can more easily cross out and mark things to come back to, though they're reasonably good tools to do that in Blue Book. But yes, download it and play with it to make sure you're comfortable. I mean, when you come in to take the test, your sole brain power should be focused on answering the questions, nothing about the process. Same was true for pencil and paper tests. Anybody who read the directions when they took the test on testing day was wasting time. You got 0 points for reading questions. You had points for doing answers. So you don't want to get caught up in trying to understand the computer system. go in comfortable with that
That's,
and
I
hope
think
that it
that's
works.
good. Yeah, I think that's good sound advice in any kind of testing situation. So that's very helpful. So Sophia asked, what about the highly selective schools that show their common data set that a large percent of enrolled students actually submitted scores? Does that make them really test optional?
Well, you need to dig down deep into that data set. I've done panels with admissions directors from places like Cornell and Caltech and UC Berkeley in recent years, and they say yes. It's you almost have to be able to read files and watch the process to know how valid the claim is. Yes, there's in some number of schools, there are higher admit rates for kids who submit scores. But what admissions directors say is that for the most part, submitters also have stronger academic records.
Mm-hmm.
They higher GPAs, more rigor in their high school courses. So it's hard to judge which factor is most important. And a lot of this is about perception. If
Right.
students and counselors believe that there is an advantage to submitting test scores, kids with high scores will submit test scores, and you get another cycle of that. I mean, it's important to understand that widespread test optional is a relatively recent social change, significant social change phenomenon. And it takes time for a change like that to get accommodated through the system. People, kids, teachers, counselors, siblings, parents, all experience the test as a common rite of passage from high school to college. And the world is different now, and it's going to take a while to fully integrate that into perceptions and reality. So, we're in trust but verify. I moderated a panel at National Association for College Admissions Counseling's most recent annual conference in Baltimore last fall with admissions directors who talking from Cornell and William and Mary and Caltech, talking through their numbers and showing the data. And I would say at those schools, the policies are what they said the policies are.
Mm-hmm.
And it was it. I mean, we did this consciously. William and Mary is permanently test optional. Cornell, some programs are test blind, some are test optional. Caltech is temporarily, at least for the next couple of years, totally test blind.
Mm-hmm. Well, and doesn't the data lag behind? I mean, as the perception and the movement was like, okay, now we're seeing the test scores now from students that are older, and I
Sure.
think we're going to see now with our freshmen, sophomores, even juniors, that movement is going to carry them along, and then we'll start seeing different admission rates in the next few years versus especially over the last few with COVID involved.
I mean, what we do know from places like the Common App and the Common Data Set is that the percentage of kids submitting scores with their applications is under 50% now with the Common App. And the number in schools reporting in the most recent Common Data Set and admits with scores has continued to decline.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned too the trend that we're seeing as counselors, and what we often debate is, okay, if it's test optional, go ahead and take the test, see if you can score really high, and if you do, then submit your scores. And if you don't submit, I mean, if you don't score at the high level, then you just don't submit them. So then that's skewing the whole testing. Anybody who's submitting test scores has got to be on that top end in order, and so that's going to skew the whole record anyway, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. A lot of people, the kind of a rule of thumb, not necessarily a good one, is if you look at the 25th to 75th percentile of submitted test scores and you're below the median, you definitely don't submit. And the only case in which you definitely do submit is if you're at the 75th percentile or above. And that does spiral up the average test score reported.
Yeah, I remember, being here in California for all the years that the University of California required the SAT. If you wanted to apply, you had to take the test. So it
Mhm.
didn't matter what your score was, you still had to take the test. And so you had a much more normal bell curve, and it was very helpful for the students to see where they fell. And now there is no normal bell curve anymore for students to use to evaluate where they're at or what they're doing. So
I think it's fair. I mean, numbers are not always what they say. We have to consider the context from which the numbers are generated.
definitely. So let's see. So Perry appreciate you being on the call today, Perry. I know he does test prep and works with students and counseling students. He said there was no problem with rollout in his area. Why would we want governmental involvement in this?
Because why would you want the governmental involvement? I didn't advocate for or against it. I just said there is no such thing. In most other countries, admissions testing is done by a governmental agency um, as a public function. What I was suggesting is that there needed to be some oversight and regulation because, if anybody on this call, you can become a test maker tomorrow morning. You don't have to take a test to become a test maker. All you do is hang out a shingle and submit the low bid and meet the criterion. And there's some companies that have behaved just like that and have had huge problems, particularly in the K-12 testing arena and teacher testing arena. There was just recently a settlement of a teacher testing lawsuit in New York City, in which the city ended up paying $750 million to teachers whose scores were not justified because the company that made the test essentially made up the validation, or so it appears.
Wow. Wow. That's well, and then and that brings that back to all the other industry tests and teaching tests and nursing tests and you know doing your nails, just those different kinds of things. Somebody brings up grade inflation, so let's talk about that. A lot of times we hear parents and students and counselors talk about, well, if they take away the test scores, then all they have left is grades, and there's huge grade inflation. So how does that factor in?
I mean, grade inflation is real, and so is test score inflation. The percentage of kids getting 34s on ACT or 14 to 1500s on SAT has increased every year because of test prep and kids not submitting lower with low scores, not submitting. So it's not like, the test gives you something that you didn't have. Well-staffed, experienced admissions offices say that they can make those distinctions well enough to build the kinds of classes that they want. I mean, has been grade inflation. People have talked about it as a problem for 3 decades now. And places, like Bowdoin, which has been test optional for 55 years. Continues to be able to build high quality classes. It can be adjusted for. I'm not denying that it exists as an issue. It's not all that much of a problem to admissions offices.
And I think that's a very key thing for us to remember, and for us as counselors to communicate to our parents and students. We need to trust the admissions office. We need to trust that they're doing what they say and that they have the knowledge and expertise in order to train their teams to be able to, I mean, they're putting together a class. I mean, their institution is vitally invested in this. I mean, it's determined by the classes that they admit. So they are going to do their very best to admit the right
through
class.
this work, I've had the opportunity to sit on panels and talk one-on-one with, dozens, hundreds of admissions officers. I think they are in it for the best interests of kids and their institutions.
Right.
And, I don't see any reason not to trust those people. I'm, particularly people who've been around for a while and have served at several institutions. There's no value to them in making stuff up.
Right, right. And there's no value in them not evaluating applications, from a perspective that contributes to their institution.
And
Not
one thing, and
looking
we
at
haven't talked
tests
about this at all, but I mean, one thing from our perspective, test optional is a win-win. We've been talking about it as a value for students. It also has been a win in many ways for admissions offices and their institutions. Typically, when a school goes test optional or test blind, they get more applicants. They get better quality applicants in terms of GPA, course rigor, extracurricular activities, range of academic interests, et cetera. And they get more diversity of all sorts. Race, particularly important after the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, but geography, academic interests, extracurricular activities, it makes it easier for them to build the kind of classes they want to build because they have a better applicant pool to draw from.
Mm-hmm. And I want to go back to that point you just said about the Supreme Court decision this past summer, and that has added to the whole college admissions and how do we really recruit a very diverse class, and testing is not a way to contribute to that diversity at all. I know from my area, and Laura, she makes a really good point about this, that middle and upper class kids are still taking the test. They're taking it there on their own and then seeing how well they do, because they can do that and not have to worry about, do I have to submit these scores? But a lot of students aren't able to do that, do the prep or spend the time. I find my students, they don't have the time to spend doing the prep nor the money, and so they represent that diverse component for the colleges. So I think the case for having a test optional is even stronger now because of that decision by the Supreme Court.
Well, I think all that is true. I think the bottom line is important, and schools that have gone test optional typically report some progress towards diversity goals and in the years after they admit test optional. It's definitely true at test blind schools. There's been tremendous improvement in representation of historically disenfranchised groups in the UC schools since the test scores were eliminated. It's, people, we have never claimed that test optional advocates have never claimed that eliminating test scores is the solution to racism or any of the other society's problems. It is taking down one barrier to access, and there are many others. We applauded pre-pandemic when the University of Chicago, a globally selected school, went test optional, not just because they eliminated their test score requirement, but because they put more money into recruiting and financial aid and the other things that make it possible to increase the pipeline of kids from backgrounds that hadn't been previously represented at campus. It's not one thing. It's a part of the solution, not the entire solution.
Right.
But it does help on average.
Yeah. Just peeling that onion away bit by bit, and and Fair Test has been able to prove that you can make a difference and can move that needle over time. So what are you looking for? We've got just a few more minutes, but what are you looking for in 2024, Bob? What are the new challenges or things that you're...
Well, every year we hear stories like those and that have been made in the comments of, some schools are considering restoring the test scores, but the total number that have done that since the pandemic, I can count on these fingers. Yes, MIT, my alma mater, Georgetown, our executive director's alma mater. We're not doing very good personally with our alumni efforts. And a few other schools, Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, University of Tennessee, and you can name maybe 5 or 6 others, have restored test scores. out of 2,000 schools that don't have them. I think the chat comment about the Ivies, I think Columbia said it's permanently test optional. Harvard is in for another several years. From our counting, and you can see it on our website because we show when policies expire on fair test optional list, that there are only about 200 schools that we don't know whether they're going to extend beyond 2024. So I think we'll still be around 2,000 schools test optional for fall 2025. And, once with each successive year, it becomes harder to restore test scores because it becomes, the way we've always done things, at least in the recent past. But beyond that, what Fair Test is pushing for is one, extending test optional or preferably test blind procedures to financial aid. In fact, we prefer to see merit aid eliminated and all that money go to need-based aid. So much of merit aid is reverse Robin Hood of giving money to the kids who are most able because of their families to go to college, and then extend that up to graduate admissions. A lot of progress with the GRE. The law schools are considering going test optional, a number of business schools as well. And we haven't talked about it here, but we have a vigorous program in K-12 where test scores still play, because of federal law, in many cases, a much more significant role. And states have set requirements. There are still 8 states where you have to pass a standardized test to get a high school diploma. There are a number of states where you have to take a test in order to get promoted. Teachers have to take tests to keep their jobs in some places. We'd like to see the movement taking down those barriers, and not to eliminate assessment, but to create assessments that are fair, open, and educationally sound. So performance assessment of the K-12 level, more emphasis on academic record and admissions from undergraduate right through PhD programs.
And I think that's the key, is that this is not just a high school issue, it's an educational issue. And it starts at kindergarten and goes clear through graduate school, professional schools. So, there is a lot of work to be done in that area, but it's very encouraging to hear that the GRE is going to be optional for some programs, that business schools are looking at, law schools are looking at. What about medical schools?
Well, it depends. I think it's an accreditation issue, both in law and medicine. The accrediting bodies require schools to use tests. So it's a fight at a different level. For SAT or GRE optional, it's a school by school level. This becomes an association level. And the Bar Association, American Bar Associations, has recommended to its member schools that you can be accredited test optional, but it's going through their process, and there is some resistance to changing the rules. But I think it's likely that law schools will be test optional in the midterm future. Medical schools, not so much, at least not yet.
Well, we'll look and see what the future holds, and I think of anything in education or in business is just being analytical and looking at it with a critical lens. You don't want to accept everything on one side or the other, just look at it from a very critical perspective and then use that to draw a conclusion. So so we're looking forward to what the future holds, and more articles. I put links, and I'll put more links in the show notes when I publish this on my website so that people have access to other resources. I put the link for merit, awards, myths, realities, and barrier to access so that people have access to that. What other last words of advice would you have for counselors working with students and parents?
Well, my first words are thank you, because as I said, we know you're the people who are forced to work for free or for minimum wages to do the testing company's business to help fulfill their coffers and takes your time away in many cases from the real work that you need to do to help kids. But make sure that the students you counsel are aware of all their options and take advantage of them. It is really a new era in which test scores never played the role that people thought they did. And now they're even less important, particularly at a number of the more progressive institutions. Encourage your kids not to waste time on test prep and spend it having a rich academic and out of school life as teenagers, because that's what admissions offices say they want to see. And everybody will be better off for it. The students, the institutions, and society, if we build a broader range of talents in our next generation.
I love that. I think that is very true. And it does reflect the perspective that our industry has for the most part, from a counseling perspective. It's sometimes hard to convince parents of that or administrators of that. So having your voice to be able to share that is very powerful too, Bob. So thank you. Well, thank you for today. Thank you for everyone being here today. It's been a great way to start our new year. And as always, this will be posted on cindymcdonald.com so that you can view the interview and see all the show notes as well. And Bob, again, thank you for your time and thank you for your dedication. And
well, thank you, Cyndy, and thanks again to all the counselors who participated. It's great.
Well, thank you. And everyone keep watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks on January 19th. I have Ellen from Rebel Creative, and we're going to talk about marketing and branding and do a branding checklist and some things like that. And just be watching for my emails. And I love getting your emails as well. So have a good
I should say the same thing. Bob Schaeffer at fairtest.org if you have any questions or need any help. Glad to help you.
And I'll publish that as well. So if you have questions, reach out to Fairtest and reach out to Bob. So have a great weekend, everyone. Have a great weekend, Bob. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.